Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. Reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker. I'm proud of it. And welcome to my show. As you can see, I'm going to do a traditional turn and twist of the world. And at the top on the right, and I'm going to go over and so you can see it, here is the Arctic Ocean. Here is Russia. Here is Greenland, which has a big ice cap on it. And that is actually part of Denmark, which is a little bitty country over there, and over here. And here's Canada, here's Alaska, part of the U.S., and then all around the top is Russia. And Russia basically kept its, at least its Arctic borders even after the Soviet Union collapsed. So a couple things are going on. As you know, I have a kind of a theme going, and that theme basically is that Russia is starting back up the Cold War. Why are they doing that? They are resentful that they lost the first Cold War. They lost a tremendous amount of territory. These countries over here, which is Ukraine, Belarus, the three Baltic countries, these countries over here, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, which has a lot of oil. This very large country over here, which is Kazakhstan, and there's four other stats, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and there's another one, but I'm afraid I don't remember it right this second. All have been detached from what was the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union had the Warsaw Pact, and the Warsaw Pact were European countries, Poland, Czech, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. Moldavia was actually part of Russia itself. So all these countries over here have been detached from what was, for all intents and purposes, one large Russian country, a Russian empire. And the Russians lost a lot. They recovered somewhat. And since then, at least since about 1999, Vladimir Putin took over from Yeltsin, basically got the oligarchs who were large owners of privatized industries after the Cold War, and took them over one by one, or brought them into his orbit. Berezovsky was mining, Khodorkovsky's in jail, owned the largest oil company, Gruzinski, I believe his name is, ran the biggest network and the largest magazines published. He was run out of the country. Gaidar. So these oligarchs who didn't ply the Putin line have been basically run out. Gazprom took over the oil companies, also a portion of the media companies, and it was owned by the government. And the government is dominated by Putin and his party. And basically there's still elections, still somewhat democratic, but right now, even though they have elections, there's only one media. The major networks have been taken over by the government. And there's a tendency, once the media is under the control of the government's basically under the control of one party. There's a majority in the parliament, and of course Putin is president, that there's basically all the trappings of a one-party state with a democracy over the top. The other thing that Putin did is they had various governorships and districts. Those governments have basically been centralized, and the powers of the governors have been reduced, so that the powers of the central government out of Moscow have been extremely increased. Plus, they built very, very large, with European money, oil and gas pipelines to Europe, giant pipeline through Poland to Germany, another one through Czech into the middle of Europe, another one down toward Italy. And these pipelines supply Europe with 50% of its crude oil and almost all of its natural gas. Europe managed to become basically somewhat independent of the Arab world for energy, became dependent on the Russians. So now Putin is at the end of his second term. He can't run again, at least not legally, unless he changes the Constitution. So he is probably going to be stepping down March of 2008 and replaced with a successor. And of course, his party has all of the means of communication under its control. And probably his successor will be from his party, under his control, and he may be in charge of Russia even from distance, or his successor may take over his party and actually be the complete president of Russia. But no matter what, the Russians have used this oil and gas money to rebuild their military industry. They now have the best ship-to-shore missile in the world that can endanger any navy. If they sell that to Iran, they can endanger the American Navy in the Persian Gulf. They sell it to Chavez in Venezuela. Venezuela's over here. It can endanger our trade throughout the Caribbean. Could be a bad situation, and Russia's kind of feeling their oats. And there's a story here that I think reflects it. During the Cold War, the Russians basically ran patrols of bombers throughout the world, in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean. They had a navy in the Mediterranean. Let's go take a look at that. Okay, I'm going to switch the world so that it doesn't look from the Arctic, which is kind of more from the Russian point of view, and I'm going to switch it so that it more runs from the Eurocentric point of view, although kind of on an angle over here. Here's Russia over here. Russians are talking about, the Russians do have ports here on the Black Sea, although their number one port ended up in the Ukraine when it fell apart, and they have partial control over it. And they lost a lot of bases over here in Georgia, which is also on the Black Sea. But the Black Sea can access the Mediterranean through Turkey, through Istanbul, and through the Bosporus. So Istanbul is over here, and the Bosporus is over here, and there's a little hole over here. I'm not going to make it bigger. And this is the Mediterranean Sea over here, which is really the dominant sea between Europe and the Middle East. And of course, there's Israel over there. So the Russians had a deep water navy that we would watch throughout the entire history of the Cold War, and even all the way back into the 1840s, when the English kicked the Russians basically back to the Crimea, and then the Crimean War. So there was a lot of Russian influence, and now during the Cold War, the Russians were the second superpower, and they have kind of resented not having that. Now that they have access to $100 billion every single year, or 100 billion euros, $140 billion every single year, just in pure, utter, outright profit from selling oil and gas to Europe. The Russians have a lot of money. They've rebuilt their aerospace industry. They're supplying arms to Iran, to Syria, to Chavez's Venezuela, and to many other countries. And so they're trying to become a superpower again with the same basic attitude as the Cold War, which is that the countries that are dependent on us are basically satellites of our policy. So what's to expect next? Well, two things to expect next. The Russians have said now that they're about to set up a Mediterranean Navy. They have a right to it. They don't really have a base the way they used to, although they are allies with Syria, and they would have to set up a base with Syria most likely. Spain, Portugal, Italy, and I believe Croatia are all members of the, and Greece or Turkey, all members of NATO and are allies of the United States and the European Union. and that kind of cuts them off of most of the coast over here. Uh, uh, Libya, which was a kind of a Russian client state back during the 80s, they've gone over and they've given back hostages that they had from Bulgaria, and they've really curried up. They paid off the kin of the Lockerbie, Scotland airliner bombing. And they've done everything they can to unite back with the EU and with the European Union. Egypt is an ally of the United States, so is Israel, and Lebanon is currently an ally, although it could be taken over by Hezbollah. I don't think so, don't think it will. So Syria is really the only way that the Russians can have a warm water base for a navy on the Mediterranean. But that would extend its power. And of course, there is the Arctic. Now, before I get into the Arctic issue, Russia used to send out flights over the Pacific, all the way down to Guam and so on and so forth, over the Philippines, Japan, which is one of our allies, and so on and so forth. China felt very, very threatened by Russian military power in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Even though they were a communist country too, and part of what we called the Communist International, they became basically an enemy of Russia, and even fought a short war over this river over here, which is the Amur River, and what the border is over some islands in between it. So the Chinese don't really like the idea of an incredible increase of Russian military power, although the Chinese diplomatically have been supporting the Russians and not supporting us in certain cases. So what the Russians are doing now is they are starting long-haul bomber flights. Well, these bombers have nuclear bombs in them. And in the past, both America had B-52s and the Russians had Tu-95s. And they would basically fly bombers 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, in case there was a nuclear confrontation. It gave them a second strike capability to strike anywhere, including America, and basically nuke us if we tried to nuke them. And of course, we had our B-52s, and we would nuke them if they tried to nuke us. And in addition, we had basically a triad: submarines with nuclear weapons on them, bombers with nuclear weapons on them, and of course intercontinental missiles, which would go over the Arctic like this. And they had all three of these wings too. And they even had another thing, which was missiles on trains, make it harder to know where those missiles were. And we tried to do the same thing with what we called the Peacekeeper. So that's just a little history of the Cold War. So what are the Russians doing now? They are resuming Tu-95 bomber flights, long-range bomber flights. You can only assume that they probably have nuclear bombs on them, as part of their rejection of the Treaty for Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. Now, we destroyed, after the Cold War, we had what we called the Nunn-Lugar law, in which case we paid for the destruction of excess nuclear materials and delivery materials, including these bombers and the old submarines and so on and so forth. And the Russians are in the process of reversing that treaty and building their own. So now they have bombers that can reach the United States, that can reach Japan, and that can actually reach the United States and Canada over land. So apparently they're starting that. They're going to, they routinely flew over the Arctic, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans, and they've actually flown as far as Guam and confronted us a little bit. Now, there were a couple incidents about 8 days ago, and I believe I talked about it, talked about an incident about 2-3 weeks ago where they took a run, and bombers practice ran over Norway, and Norway, of course, it goes all the way over the top here and borders on Russia right over here, and England and actually entered British airspace and forced the British to scramble their fighters. So now they've also had an incident where they sent bombers over Guam, which is one of our outposts. It's right about there. Here's Hawaii over here, and Guam is halfway to kind of Japan and the Philippines, and forced us to scramble our fighters over Guam. So these are Cold War tactics, and they're becoming more and more serious. The Russians are extending their power. They're also extending their military supplies to potential enemies of the United States, especially Hugo Chavez. There's a plan, and we don't know whether it's been signed yet. I believe it has, to sell $2.4 billion worth of submarines. Now, what does Hugo Chavez need submarines for, except to try to disrupt American trade and to take over the Caribbean militarily? Here's Venezuela right here. Here's America. There's no doubt about it. We have the capability. We have we have sonar devices and so on and so forth. We can find these submarines. We can blow them up. However, it would take quite a campaign to be able to do it. And about half our trade, probably more than half right now, come from the Pacific, because China has taken over manufacturing so much. But a little less than half of the trade, most of the trade from Europe, the oil trade from Nigeria, and so on and so forth, all come in to the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is a funny sea, because we have all these ports over here in Texas. Louisiana, of course, is New Orleans, and that's the entryway to the Midwest. Pretty much it has to go through Deepwater Channel here between Florida and Cuba, and of course Cuba was our enemy during the Cold War. There's a channel right next to Grenada. Of course, we invaded Grenada once when it was taken over by a small communist group, and that's another way in. And then there's another round between Cuba and the other direction, and Puerto Rico, which is over here and part of the United States itself. So there's basically only a few choke points. It doesn't take very much to disrupt trade to the whole interior of the United States and to the north of South America and Central America. And we have a lot of allies here. NAFTA is Canada, U.S., and Mexico. And then CAFTA are all these states over here, ironically, and the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Ironically, one of the CAFTA members that has free trade with the United States is Nicaragua. Nicaragua is now controlled by Ortega, who's a Sandinista, which basically is 1980s communist. And then, of course, we have Venezuela over here, and then we have their Hugo Chavez's allies who are trying to take over Bolivia and Ecuador. Ecuador, oddly enough, is marched a little bit off the reservation when it comes to U.S. relations by joining a free trade agreement with the United States, as has Colombia right over here. So Ecuador is kind of halfway. They have a left-wing president who threw the army around the Congress, shut the Congress down, had a referendum to abolish Congress, replace it with a constitutional assembly, in which case the president would get a tremendous amount of power. And then we have the same kind of thing over here in Bolivia. Now, Bolivia is run by a guy named Evo Morales, who's the president of Bolivia. He was elected at the end of 2005, so he's been there about a year and a half. And during his year and a half, he's been following the same procedures as Hugo Chavez. Basically what he did is he abolished the Constitution, ran a referendum for a National Assembly for a new Constitution, and set up a militia. He is an indigenous South American, or what we used to call an Indian, and and he set up militias around the country of his Indian allies and left-wing allies beholden to his party. Now, the thing about Bolivia is that Morales, who is backed by Chavez, his election campaign was paid for by Chavez. He has Venezuelan bodyguards to protect him. And Brazil, in order to become independent of the world oil industry, invested a lot in natural gas right over here in what they call the lowland half moon, shaped like this. And there are 4 provinces there, and they're basically dominated by a certain set of governors that don't like Evo Morales. And basically, Evo Morales is forcing through a constitutional assembly, but he kind of jumped himself because he doesn't have an absolute majority or an absolute 2/3 majority of all the delegates. So these governors are still in opposition to him. He hasn't completely declared a dictatorship yet. He has, however, nationalized the tin industry, the natural gas industry, and in nationalizing the natural gas industry, he basically kicked out the Brazilians, and the Brazilians lost their shirts and made an enemy out of kind of the moderate left-wing president of Brazil named Lula. So Bolivia and Chavez have been making an agreement with Argentina, for Argentina to come in, replace Brazil, and invest in these lowland facilities over here. The catch is the governor doesn't like it, and the governor has been agitating to basically separate themselves and secede if the Constitution is passed that basically centralizes the government under Morales, makes him into the dictator. So we're watching that situation very, very closely. And again, Chavez has been trying to get rid of the Andean agreement called CAN, which are the Andean nations, like a little free trade group, and replace it with a we don't like America bloc of countries. Colombia has dropped out of that, and so has, oddly enough, Ecuador has been playing both. They both joined Chavez's economic group and has a free trade association with America, and so does Peru have a free trade association. So the situation in South America is very, very interesting, very, very volatile, and the situation is aggravated by Russia selling over $3 billion worth of arms, planes, submarines, everything else to Venezuela, to Hugo Chavez, who wants to become a regional superpower in South America. And then we have the Arctic over here. I'm going to show, and I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to see if I can find it over here. I might have to turn away for a second. Basically, the Russians are claiming that this ridge that goes over here from Greenland all the way to Siberia, the Lomonosov Ridge, is the continental shelf of Russia. And there is an agreement and a group called UNSCOM, which is a UN group that basically controls who has the mineral rights under the ocean. And the law is, or the rule is, that the mineral rights go out to either 200 miles from the border, and we have over here on my other shoulder, this is the continental shelf of North America, and we have complete rights over oil and gas and so on and so forth, all the way out here to the continental shelf, even though it is more than 200 miles from the coast. So the Russians are claiming this whole chunk of the Arctic and everything in it. And of course that cuts out Norway over here, Canada over here, America over here, and Denmark, which controls Greenland. And Canada is building a base over here and a base over there. And putting troops over there. Right now there's only 400 Canadian troops over the entire Arctic. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and I'm proud of it. I will be on Tuesday at 7 o'clock, and thank you for watching.